Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this live broadcast for this afternoon's Leaving COVID Behind, Preparing for Recovery webinar, jointly presented by EUROCONTROL and ACI Europe. My name is Stephen Moore. I'm the head of the ATM Network Operations Division here at EUROCONTROL in Brussels, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. So, the vaccinations are being rolled out. There is pent-up demand for air travel, both in the leisure and business sectors, as well as, of course, the continuing need for essential travel. What challenges do we face in airports in Europe, and are we ready and able to meet them? What lessons have been learned from summer 2020, and what preparations are underway? What can we do about the lack of harmonisation of restrictions and rules by the states? What needs to be prioritised to deal with the recovery? And how can we help to build back better aviation in Europe from the airport perspective, with a view not just of the short, but also perhaps the medium and long-term future? So on this basis, I would like to introduce you to the programme for the next 90 minutes. And if we could bring up the opening slide, please. It's probably worth just reminding you that, or in fact advising you that for this session, should you wish to ask any questions of the panellists that we'll be presenting to you, there are the opportunity to use the Q&A function here within the Zoom platform. And also, should you have any issues or experiencing any problems, please use the chat functionality, which we will be monitoring in the background. But key to remember, please raise your questions through the Q&A button and the functionality shown there on the screen for you. So bearing that in mind, and without further ado, let me get underway, please, with the introduction of the agenda for you this afternoon. If we can just bring up the next slide, having introduced myself. We're looking at the webinar programme as follows then. After me, I'll be very pleased to welcome Aidan Flanagan for the introduction, and also then handing over to Sergio Fernandez for the collaboration from the airline perspective at airports, key takeaways from the Eurocontrol study on the COVID-19 impact presented by Daniel Skoglund, case study from Brussels Airport presented by Gillian Prudhomme, and then into two panel discussions. The first one looking at the studies and the survey results, and the second one trying to tease out some of these areas of the lessons that have been learned and the challenges and the proposed way forward. Finally, wrapping up the entire discussions again by Aidan Flanagan from ACI Europe. I'll introduce the speakers again as we go along. So for a bit of scene setting by myself here as the moderator, this is a picture that you might not be familiar with, but you'll certainly be familiar with the overall feeling of the amount of aviation traffic in the network in terms of how it affects you at your airports or in your ANSPs or in your relative lines of business in the sector. The yellow line there clearly showing the flights currently progressing from April 2020 all the way through to a couple of days ago, and then the very light blue line at the top indicating the traffic from 2019. We can see the clear differences, but we can also see the signs of hope that we had last year in the summer of 2020 as the traffic picked up and then dipped down towards the end of the year period. And we are slowly now seeing some small creeping upwards of traffic volumes within the network. Moving on to the next picture, of course, this is an airports webinar primarily. So from the airport perspective, again, too, the top 40 airports across the ECAC area there, we're seeing some very slight and moderate increases in traffic. This picture happening to be from the 7th of March comparing to the week before, but slowly but surely traffic is creeping back into the network. We're all aware, of course, of the news items across the European region indicating that perhaps restrictions will remain largely in place until after the Easter seasonal break. Moving on, in late 2020, November 2020, Eurocontrol StatFor team issued the 5-year forecast for Europe based on the known intelligence at the start of November, which was just before the vaccination strategies started to be rolled out across the states in Europe. And there were 3 scenarios, 1, 2, and 3. You can see them there clearly on the screen. I just draw the attention to scenario 1, which indicated potentially 75% of 2019 traffic as an average in 2021. If that turns up, how ready are we really to deal with that volume of traffic, especially in the more peaky nature the traffic will deliver into our airports? Earlier this year, in January, in fact, Statfor revised the forecast based on the vaccination strategy as was known at the time. And you can see there the strategy and the scenarios of A and B, but also with the dotted blue line that I highlight there with the circle, you can see that we're tracking a little bit above the best case scenario as was revised in January. So again, how ready are we to deal with perhaps a very high level of traffic compared to 2020, getting close in some cases to 50% of 2019 traffic. We're seeing a stable trend until approximately the 28th of March this year in terms of the traffic outlook, primarily, of course, because that's when the summer schedules are introduced by the airlines. We're seeing potentially we might peak at 40% of the traffic of 2019, maybe peak days seeing 12,000 movements within the European network. So as I say, about 40% of the traffic from 2019. But as we go into the summer schedules from March 28th this year, we're looking at the information coming in and we're seeing that we might actually get closer to the 50% of the traffic in 2019, giving us peak days of 16,000 flights within the network. That then obviously can be affected by the state restrictions that may have a continuing further or altered impact on the predictions as they come in. Obviously, there may be ad hoc cancellations due to last-minute changes in such restrictions. And as such, here at Eurocontrol, we've been encouraging all stakeholders, including the airlines, airports and ANSPs, to foresee that predictability in the network could be quite volatile, and therefore we may need to put in a buffer in the traffic demand outlook that we're presenting to indicate that actually there might be more traffic coming in and to prepare us to be able to deal with that. Moving on, the volatility in the network is something that at Eurocontrol we've been considering quite closely with our partners at ACI Europe as well as others to think how we might offer more granularity and support into the forecast that we're giving. And very briefly, we've managed to look at the traffic and passenger loading, which is very volatile, and understand that this volatility gives an issue into airports who are trying to anticipate the staffing needs and the challenges that that presents. So we've come up with a way of monitoring the commercial flights and seats that are being offered on the market, providing this information in a way that gives predicative indications on the average occupancy that we might see and passenger demand per airport terminal day by day, giving predictions that are refreshed daily for the next 8 weeks for airports within the ECAC area, built in the background from the relation that we're seeing between the price and the demand and the history of the price that we're seeing available, which should give some stability to enable us to manage collectively as airports within the network some of the volatility. What does this show? Well, on a network level, which is not necessarily of the highest interest here at an airports conference, we can see, for example, on the 17th of April here, the slide picture on the left there shows the demand for people leaving those countries that are not green. And on the right, for the same day, the demand into the other countries. So if I were to summarize that slide, we're seeing demand from the south of Europe returning to the north of Europe. Not a surprise, considering that's the end of the Northern European Easter holiday break. We're seeing the demand there through this passenger demand prediction. There's some other added values for the airports there that we think is available, and I'll click through some of those quite quickly here. We're able to show this information in a secured environment only to individual airports about their airport, giving the day-to-day arrival and departure passenger demand prediction, enabling some of that volatility, of course, to be taken away, giving a graphical representation of the average load factors that are being predicted based on the inputs that we're getting, enabling us to demonstrate a graphical representation of the passenger demand for the airport, a graphical representation of the commercial flights that are being offered, and giving that demand prediction by origin or destination, which you can see graphically demonstrated in the screen there. If you haven't already heard about this, or if you want more information, I'll leave this coming up. Please do get in touch with the contact details as you see there. The details will be available afterwards as well. Just please put in the subject line, the information is requested there so we can understand where you're asking from and get the information to you and secure logins organised. I see that we've got in excess of 250 people connected to the webinar, which is great. I see I'm on time as well, which is even more a miracle. So I'd like to introduce the first of our contributors today and hand over to the introduction by Aidan Flanagan. Aidan is the Manager Safety, Capacity, ATM and Single European Sky, ACI Europe. He's currently connected in from Amsterdam, if I'm not mistaken. So Aidan, I'd like to hand over to you for the introduction, please. Good afternoon to you.
Yes, thank you, Stephen, and good afternoon, everybody. From just down the road from you, actually, here in Brussels, Stephen. So,
even better.
Yes. Yes, so good afternoon and a warm welcome from all of us at ACI Europe to our webinar here today, jointly with EUROCONTROL. Good timing, as I think, as we can see from the slides Stephen just showed, we're pretty much 1 year on from when this crisis really began to hit home. And since then, we've been doing all manner of work within ACI Europe and with EUROCONTROL in order to support airports through this crisis. So I thought I would just give you all a snapshot of what we've been doing, which should then help to set the scene for what we intend to be doing today. So what we've been doing within ACI Europe and with EUROCONTROL is supporting airports through the crisis, helping airports to manage the crisis period and prepare for recovery, which of course is one of the topics we're looking at today. Some examples of that were the documents that we provided through our Off the Ground project back during last spring, summer, where among many different deliverables across the whole airport business, with relevance to those of us here today, we produced guidance documents on safety and airside operations, getting your airport operation up and running again, what needed to be taken into account and looked at when doing so, and particularly with relevance to our discussions here today on scheduling and capacity, what needed to be considered, especially as a result of the new health measures brought in the airport terminal in terms of managing your capacity and your schedule. And of course, then the independent studies carried out jointly with other institutions, such as the one seen here on the slide, which we'll discuss later on in the panels today, the impact assessment of COVID-19 measures on airport performance, which we'll be discussing in greater depth later on. All of these done with a great participation and collaboration between ACI Europe, our members, and our colleagues over at EUROCONTROL. So yeah, some examples of the studies which were carried out. The one carried out by the Airport Research Centre, commissioned by EUROCONTROL, ACI Europe, we played a partnering role in that alongside our members Stuttgart, Swedavia, Groupe ADP, Heathrow, as well as IATA. So we'll hear a lot about this later on. Another example of a study on this carried out was one done by 270 along with Brussels Airport. Again, we'll be hearing more about this later. So these sorts of things are helping to set the scene and assist airports in the decisions which will need to be taken in getting the airport up and running again in the new context. We've also been doing a lot of work with the network manager, weekly coordination through an NDOP recovery cell, network directors of operations, weekly briefings on the network overview, the situation and its evolution. So here, for example, is a snapshot of the sort of information that was shared in this week's meeting just yesterday on the current picture in terms of daily number of flights, etc. The change compared to the previous week. So quite similar to what Stephen just showed us, this being shared on a weekly basis with the members from throughout the European network. So our goals here today are really to show you, as I say, the work that's been done in the past year, how this can help you as an airport to get ready for passengers returning in considerable number, what you need to be doing, what you need to be considering and working on in terms of your operation, and how best to manage the uptick in passengers. So in a nutshell, what are the operational challenges when passengers return in numbers? What guidance is available to help you in this? What have other airports been doing? How can we share experience and really help us all as a network? How to prepare for this return in traffic, which, as we saw from the prediction slides which Stephen showed, we should hopefully be seeing some good ramp up in the months ahead, and we all need to be ready for that. I'll leave it with that and hand back over to Stephen and to our great speakers and panelists. That's where we are. This is what we hope to achieve today, and wish everybody a fruitful and instructive discussion.
Thank you, Aidan, for that introduction. And it gives me great pleasure now to introduce the first of our panelists who are going to present to you this afternoon. Sergio Fernandez is the Regional Director, Airports, Passenger, Cargo and Security for Europe at IATA, and he's going to talk to us about the collaboration at airports from the airline perspective. Sergio, good afternoon from Madrid, and I hand the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk to you today. As Aidan was talking today, it's an interesting day. You know, I'm based in Madrid, and 1 year ago, exactly, the government announced the close of the schools due to this pandemic. So 1 year later, we are discussing about leaving this COVID behind. Hopefully, we really are leaving this COVID behind. So basically, my presentation is going to be very quick, and I'm going to just discuss with you what is the situation and what we have done, and basically what are the challenges in order to leave this COVID crisis behind. In 2020, the industry has done a hell of a job regarding the guidance. We have worked with governments, with European institutions, with international institutions. We have guidance from ICAO. We have guidance from EASA, from the CDC. ACI has provided guidance to the airports. We as IATA has provided guidance to the airlines. We have created a documentation about a layered approach to biosafety and specific touch points. So we have done an amazing job in order to ensure a safe and secure travel. But what is the reality? The reality, and if you look at the European non-pharmaceutical intervention, so that means the measure that has been implemented in Europe, and when I mean Europe is from Europe to Russia, including CIS countries, more to ICA countries in that sense, we have seen that more than 42 countries have some type of quarantine, of safe isolations, 29 temperature checks, 25 states with health declaration forms, 28 with contact tracing solutions. Some of them don't have it, or some of them are not even thinking about having them, or have created and has dropped it. And we have around 49 states or territories which have COVID testing upon arrival. So basically, what is the reality? The reality is that there is no a single restriction measure that has been implemented in a harmonized way. We have this guidance, in the paper is great, everybody will follow, but at the end, in Europe, each country is implementing their own testing strategy, their own quarantine and self-isolation strategy, who could enter, who could not enter, what is the criteria in order to impose or to restrict or to remove restrictions, and also in order to restart travel now that we have the vaccination in place, what is going to be the roadmap, what is going to be the criteria. Each country is different. And in order to illustrate, you know, I have put there 3 examples, the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy. We are collecting information about all restrictions that are over the world and are public in the IATA Travel Center. And in that sense, you know, you have these 3 interesting examples that between the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy, there is no agreement about the type of test. There is no agreement about the time that you need to do the test. If you have kids, you know, passengers younger than 30 years old are not required to have testing in the Netherlands, but in Germany, only younger than 6, and in Italy, only younger than 2. If you need to provide a passenger locator form, you need to provide it in paper in some of those states. In Italy, if you go to Calabria, you need to use one form. If you go to Puglia, you need to use another form. You go to the Netherlands, you need to have only not PCR, but also rapid or antigen test 4 hours before entering into the Netherlands. So you can imagine that this has created what? Confusion among passengers. Even friends, colleagues that were frequent travelers are now completely lost about what are the criteria, the documentation, and the type of test that need to provide to the destination. That type of changes on restrictions and on policy from governments are changing completely the booking and cancellation behaviors. We have seen that passengers are booking, are canceling flights within 24 hours, 48 hours time schedule. So basically it's almost impossible to predict. We have passengers that even come with positive PCR tests trying to board, and we need to deny boarding. We have unexpected routes around 20 passengers that need to be denied boarding because they are not able to comply with the requirements. Airlines are requested to do extra checks regarding documentation, regarding the validity of certificates. It's a PCR, it's LAMP, it's TMA, that create a lot of queues, passengers completely dissatisfied about the process, risk environment, because at the end, something that we discussed at the beginning of the crisis is that we need to ensure quick movement and smooth processes, and this is not taking place in some cases. And also, in some countries and in some airports, we have seen that for less than 50% of the passenger volumes, we need to have the same number of resources or even more resources in order to do these extra checks that are required for the governments. So really, to leave this crisis behind, and what we need governments to implement those measures in an harmonized way. Measures to have a normal and harmonized criteria as well about what restrictions to put, when to remove them. We need also to have governments to embrace digitalization. We have now, 1 year after the crisis started, specific states implementing health declaration forms in paper 1 year after this crisis has started. So we need to ask them and to push them to embrace digitalization. We need to push them as well in order to enable contactless solutions. So we don't want just to have a custom or border control official just to check my passport or my test certificate in paper after have checked another 1,000 people before. So we are talking now about safe environment. That means that we need to have contactless process and secure and safe processes. And also, we need to have from governments a clear restart roadmap when we are able to go back to some type of normality. What are the key indicators that they are going to use? It's not, we are now having a vaccination roadmap in place. We cannot just work like in 2020 thinking about the incidence of the virus. We need to take into account other criteria like vaccination, like hospital admission. So we need to go far beyond that and prepare those roadmaps. We have seen that, and good example is UK, that even announcing a roadmap into the future when things are going to open, that enable the opening of the market. This foster demand. Passengers making bookings, buying tickets, doing reservations in hotels. So that's what we need, just to have a roadmap to ensure that passengers could go to this type of normality. Airports are suffering in the same way than airlines, this lack of predictability, this crazy policy restrictions all over the place. So we need to ensure and we need to support the communication to passengers. What are the criteria? What is the information? What is the documentation that they need to come to the airport before traveling? Again, I mentioned as an example, we have passengers with a positive PCR test trying to board, and we have issues in the airports and all the border gates saying, guys, you need to go to the doctor, you need to go to your house, but you cannot travel because you are positive on COVID. So we need to foster this communication. We need to foster also contactless process across the airports in the different touch points. And basically, and something that we have worked pretty well in 2020 is we need to join forces as an industry in order to push for policy changes in an harmonized way and in order to enable and faster and secure travel for all of us. That's all for me, Steven. So thank you very much, and happy to join the panel later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio, for that interesting perspective from the IATA point of view. And of course, we can see some questions coming in through the Q&A functionality. A good time to remind you all connected, please do use the Q&A functionality. But some questions coming in about the lack of harmonisation there, clearly resonating with people connected and resonating with people at large across Europe. It's now my great pleasure to turn to Daniel Skoglund, the head of APOC performance team at Swedavia, to ask for the presentation around the key takeaways from Eurocontrol study on the COVID-19 impact. Daniel, good afternoon to you, and I hand over to you.
Good afternoon from sunny Madrid, hopefully, to snowy Stockholm. And I'll just share my slides here with you. And good afternoon to everyone. My name is Daniel Skoglund. I'm head of APOC performance team at Stockholm Arlanda Airport, who is part of Swedavia. Swedavia is a stately owned organization in Sweden who operates 10 airports, from Stockholm Arlanda, a big international airport, to our smallest airport, who only carries around 5 daily flights. So we have a wide spectrum of different airports. And I'm going to talk about how COVID-19 measures affect airport performance. And we're going to start off with, we had an initial partnership here of this study, COVID-19 impact analysis on airport operation. This study was commissioned by EUROCONTROL, and was headed out under the lead of simulation experts at Airport Operations Center. The work was held in collaboration with ACI Europe and supported by IATA. And to furthermore contribute with insights from airport experts, 4 additional airports joined this study, namely Paris-Charles de Gaulle, London Heathrow, Stuttgart Airport, and Stockholm Arlanda, who is part of Swedavia Airports. This project aimed towards providing airports with an impact assessment and recommendations on airport performance, but as well as with some guidance for the implementation of measures in order to minimize the performance deterioration. The objective of this COVID-19 impact analysis on airport performance study was first to determine to what degree the COVID measures impact passenger journey times through a terminal. How much additional space might airport need in key zones that are most affected by COVID measures? And lastly, given the impacts of these measures, at what percentage of 2019's traffic volumes will airports reach saturation capacity? And just to have a short slide here to put the simulation into perspective. This was the simulation model of the terminal which ARC, the Airport Research Center, created for us. As it's stated in the above there, it's generic enough, not to be specific, but customizable for all the different measures that we needed to simulate. And to go in deeper to this terminal look, this model covered basically all terminal processes, even health checkpoints. But in addition to that, the standard process of check-in, security, gate areas, boarding, and the turnaround process. And to dig in furthermore and have a look on specifically how this study was conducted, we're going to look on how the security control and the impact on the throughput at security control. This is an example of how the simulation was used to identify the impact of COVID measures at the throughput in security. In this instance, the study identified 3 different areas of impact. The first, impact in space, and now in red here as an example. An impact of space with the throughput was less drop-off points due to physical distancing. The second area was the impact on demand here in green. And you can see another red example here. The repeated scan of passengers preferred instead of having manual pat-downs. So the demand on the security control increases. And lastly, the impact on processing times. An example here on the lower half, more liquid in bags due to hand sanitations, for example, which required more processing times in the X-ray machines. In the same manner as I explained for security throughput, the study did similar simulations for the other areas in the terminal until we covered both the departing and the arriving passenger journey. And I will now share with you the key findings of this simulation we did with the ARC team. But before we go into the key findings, there's some important things to bear in mind here. The following results are based on the following 2 assumptions. The first one is for health check centers. We did the simulations on them, but their impact is not included in the results. And the second part, social distancing. This is the key thing here. When we did social distancing in this simulation, it was at an area of 1.5 meters, or roughly 2 square meters per passenger. The results might increase exponentially if this social distancing is increased to 2 meters. So bear that in mind as we see the results here. But we're going to start off with focusing on the departing passenger process. Basically check-in, security control, you go to a gate and wait there until you have boarding. In the study, we found that up to 10 minutes of additional time for the departing passenger journey was needed. And in terms of space, 50% additional space was required in check-in to maintain social distancing. But the biggest bottleneck was in security. There we needed 100% additional space to maintain the social distancing of just 1.5 meters. And when we looked at boarding gates, it was between 35 to 50% of the boarding gate area determining the size. Going the other way around, focusing on the arrival process, the boarding, immigration, and baggage reclaim, the journey time increased from between 5 to 20 minutes, depending on the setup. And here, especially immigration is the big bottleneck for us. 100% extra space was needed with this 1.5 social distancing. But also the second part is in the baggage reclaim area, where 30 to 50% additional space was needed. So continuing on with some other key conclusions that we found in the study. Additional measures are needed to mitigate the impact if health checks are required for arrival and transfer. This is a really big one with the health checks. It's a really big bottleneck in the simulations. Moving on, there's no benefits of asking passengers to come early to the airport, since if they arrive early to the airport, they will need to be held somewhere before check-in open, which means there's less area for passengers to already be waiting for check-in or security control, for example. A third point, airports who already were congested before the COVID crisis, they can expect that their maximum saturation capacity at just 60 to 75% of the 2019 traffic volumes. So keep that in mind for those of you who are airports who are already at the maximum capacity levels. Airports, from our side, we need to focus on the key limiting components in the airports. First and foremost, security control and immigrations. Basically, we need to focus on the throughput. We need to maintain a high level of throughput through these processes. Secondly, boarding gates and baggage reclaim areas. This is an area where passengers are waiting in terms of starting a new process. We need to find extra space to hold these passengers in a safe way. And the last recommendation from our side, to avoid further delays and conflicting requests to passengers, we need greater harmonization in terms of COVID measures. One example which I'm aware of last summer was the health forms. Some had paper forms, some had digital forms, some had QR codes. And this really affected the turnaround process at airports. And lastly, the color coding, which was put in place last year by the European Union to report about the pandemic evolution in different countries, really made passengers unsure on which areas were safe, if it were countries or if it were regions or if it was just cities. So what would be beneficial for all parties involved here? Well, the most beneficial of them all, rebuilding trust. This is essential, not just for their own local community, but throughout the whole European member states. And lastly, crisis management effectiveness. This is an excellent tool to boost your crisis management with this kind of simulations. This report is available at Eurocontrol's webpage for the library there. Just search for airport performance. It's a very, very good study, which I highly recommend. If you have additional questions, you can contact Bruno de Sart at Eurocontrol as well. And that was it from my side, and I leave the floor. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Daniel. A very interesting presentation there. Of course, the report released towards the end of last summer and obviously still full of pertinent information. Lots of questions coming in on the Q&A that I can see. We've got over 300 people connected, so please do keep bringing those questions in. We're going to progress, before we get to the panel and the discussions, to pick up some of the questions. We're going to progress now to our last speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Gillian Prudhomme, the Airport Planning Manager here just over the road at Brussels Airport in Zaventem. Gillian, over to you, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Stephen, and thanks for introducing me. Thanks for having me in this webinar. Very happy to be joining and to be sharing our case study on the preparation for recovery here at Brussels Airport, which we've done in cooperation with 270 Aviation Consultants. A fairly short agenda for today. First of all, setting the scene, giving some facts and figures about Brussels Airport itself, and then going into our approach for the recovery after the COVID crisis, and going into the simulation results that we've conducted together with 270 before going into the actions we took based on these results. But as I said, first some facts and figures. Brussels Airport usually had some 26.4 million passengers in 2019 before the COVID crisis. These numbers dropped significantly to 6.7 million in 2020. Thankfully, our cargo numbers went up by 2% to over 500,000 tons in 2020, thanks to our excellent cargo position and the specialty of distributing the vaccines and cooled cargo transport. So what is important to know for the sake of this presentation is that Brussels Airport is a peak-driven airport with two main peaks, one large morning peak where the short-haul traffic connects to the international traffic, and one evening peak where there's mainly intra-European connections going on. So our assets at our airport are then typically stress tested during these peak times in a non-COVID situation. So in order to make sure that our assets are equipped as needed and that there's sufficient staffing, manpower and experience available for the passenger demand, we have several teams at Brussels Airport working on these requirements. First of all, our Airport Operations Center, which is located in really as the heart of our airport, together with our Airport Operations team, Passenger Services team, and then last but not least, the Optimization and Planning team. As I said, they're responsible for all the requirements needed to cope with the traffic. And the operational planning during this crisis that was pretty interesting was based on a variety of parameters from both internal and external sources. So think of actual airline bookings, handler reservation systems, but also airline intelligence through our aviation development team, and machine learning, but also working together with the slot coordinator, for example. So from all these sources, we gain input to provide as much capacity as we can for the demand we expect on the short term. Then looking at the approach we took for our recovery, first of all, it's important to state that as an airport, it's not been easy to meet all demand, but we have been able to meet passenger demand and respect the international rules and guidelines throughout the entire crisis, which has indeed almost been going on for almost a year now. And we've identified that there have been several factors contributing to these modified airport planning, as you can call it, and we've listed them up. We've listed them here. First of all, the international and national restrictions, because sometimes national restrictions can deviate from the international ones. The airline schedule modification, both last minute and well known in advance. The different passenger show profiles and behavior. I think that's a very big one for our airport. And I think airports in general around the world, that it has been very difficult to predict when passengers show up at the airport, at your check-in location, at your screening, at your border control, because some passengers prefer to be there well in advance to assure that they won't miss their flight with the additional document checks and the additional tests that need to be undertaken. But other passengers prefer not to stay too long among a large crowd, which is why they show up later. So that's been pretty interesting for us as an airport to plan on. And as I said, additional document checks here in Belgium. We have to fill in quite some documents as a passenger if you want to travel. Obviously also hygienic and social distancing measures, planned maintenance activities, and the necessary cost-saving measures to cope with the effects of the crisis. So these factors have all contributed to a modified way of planning our airport, both on the midterm and the short term. Our operations team was then able to forecast several bottlenecks in key areas, which obviously shifted throughout the time, but mostly we saw bottlenecks at our check-in location due to the different show profiles and the longer time it took for the document checks, but also at border control and our boarding areas, all areas where a physical check is basically performed by staff or border control agents. And actually, as a benchmark to our internal analysis by our teams I just mentioned before, 270 offered to run parallel analysis for key processors with simulations in order for us to benchmark the internal analysis. And you can actually see here, so 270 offered doing this for both airside and terminal. And here you can see in a small video simulation of the airfield model, which we actually used to benchmark our internal study to see if it was possible to close parts of our physical infrastructure, so our physical piers and some walk to stand operations. The other reason why 270 performed the simulation is to identify if it would be possible to reduce the runway configuration system in any way to improve efficiency. So the same visualization basically for terminal, which is crucial because you want to see the entire airport system as a whole. You want to see the passenger moving from the airspace into the car park, and you want to see if the social distancing measures can be adhered to, obviously. So in terms of actions, first of all, it's important to state that as a whole, we've concluded that you constantly need to evaluate a mixture of both the operational demand and the passenger experience, which are basically the first criteria of an airport, together with the required measures from national and international organizations, by applying as much cost efficiency as possible and link it to the mid to long term planning. The latter, which is my field of expertise, is key, because you don't want to block any future long-term development by short-term decisions that might hypothesize them. So the simulations actually strengthened our analysis with the advantage, as I said, of a total airport system approach, and sometimes we challenged our own data with the simulation, which was very useful. So as a whole, we were able to identify that our current 3-peer system, so we currently have 2 non-Schengen peers and a Schengen peer, could actually be reduced to 2 peers, 1 non-Schengen and 1 Schengen peer. We only require 1 check-in hall at the time of the simulation instead of 2, and that our walk to stand and busing operation could be reduced, which is quite vital for our operations. We also identified the potential effects, both the pros and cons of a potential single runway operation, which we decided not to go to. So we decided to continue with our existing runway configuration, and the required infrastructure and manpower capacity for all the operational needs. Obviously, also the amount of flexibility needed to cope with any unforeseen circumstances. And at last, we also included the additional actions that we believe, and which we have also already implemented, are needed in a new normal post-crisis situation. The first being that we successfully operate as a COVID test center at our curb, of which some of our panel colleagues have already made use of, I heard earlier today. We also identified which planned maintenance could be brought forward in calm times, and we constantly continue to evaluate how we can diversify services towards anti-fragility and generation of new income streams. Obviously, we also look further ahead into sustainable development and technology and process optimization, opposed to infrastructure development. And at last, the recommendation from our team, strategic planning team, is that our team really believes that the industry should focus on succeeding in recovering, which will be very strict and complex recovery, but secondly also position ourselves for regrowth against a range of scenarios in what is a reinvented new normal aviation industry. So thanks a lot, and over to the next speaker, I guess.
Thank you very much, Gillian. It was very interesting. So we turn to our first panel discussion now. We've got over 310 people connected now, with lots of questions coming in. The first panel discussion is going to look at these studies in a little bit more detail and the results of them by addressing a few questions to particular panelists, and then I'll try and integrate some of the other questions that are coming in through the Q&A. So please don't forget to utilize the Q&A functionality through Zoom. Chat if you've got an issue, but please Q&A for us to pick up the questions for the panelists. If you want to direct your question to a particular panelist, please just indicate, and we'll do our best to make sure that that gets across. We won't have time to collect all of the questions, but surely we will do the very best to loop in as many as we can. So if I can turn to the first panel discussion, then looking at the studies and the survey results, the first question perhaps to Daniel from Swedavia. We've got a few additional questions to ask, but firstly, okay, so we've got the studies, the outcome of the studies done by EUROCONTROL and the ARC. So what? What did you do differently? What did you do with the outcomes of these studies from a Stockholm-Arlanda perspective, for example?
Thank you very much. And maybe just to start off with, firstly, the external part, I think the partnership was really important for us, that this is a new world for us to act in. I think it was really great to have this partnership, both with EUROCONTROL, the experts at the Airport Research Center, but also our colleagues at the other airports, to know, okay, what measures do they expect in their local country, since this is, as we put forward from our colleague in Belgium, that where both international and national measures was really important for us. But looking inwards at Stockholm Arlanda and Swedavia from the perspective, it might be an understatement to say that this is a brave new world, a whole new thing for us, a game changer. And we didn't have any go-to manuals to look, okay, how should we act? How should we do? And in my experience, it's fairly easy to just go out and do things. And this was a problem for us, because I think it's bad if you just go out and just implement a lot of things before knowing, okay, what can we do? We would like to avoid that. And it was hard for us. We're not that well established with a data-driven decision-making at our airport right now. So this study really gave us a really good tool to see, okay, if we do this, this will impact the throughput, for example. It was really helpful for us in the security control where we had a big problem. The results from the study to show, for example, okay, you might expect that we need to have more scannings, for example. We need to have more social distancing, so we cannot utilize all the drop-off points as security. Those things were really good for us. And we could see, okay, in the simulation, we had the throughput, for example, of 170 passengers per hour, and we could match that for 165. So it was really good for us that we had a kind of a benchmark. It's not one solution fits all, but it's really good to have this kind of benchmark for us. And to not maybe underestimate saying things here, the effects of social distancing was a really shock for us. We could not expect on how big of a problem it would become for us. And the study only confirmed it. And once during the summer, when passenger numbers picked up, it became a real problem for us. And now we're in waiting for this summer to come, that we're really shocked, okay, what will this summer mean for us? We don't have any good figures in terms of booking. We don't know, okay, what would the effects of last year, since I think it will be greater this summer. So this study has been really a kind of a handbook for us when we're looking, okay, this is what we can expect if we don't do things. And this is what we can expect if we do data-driven decisions and simulated results.
Thank you, Daniel. And of course, hopefully the information that we'll be able to share in that harmonised and collaborative manner with regard to the passenger demand prediction for any airport that is able to sign up, but certainly from your perspective, will hopefully give a bit of that extra additional information as to what's likely to be the demand coming through the front door or the airside door, as it were. Thank you for that. A couple of supplementary questions have come in for you, Daniel, which I'd like to pick one up now with regard to just the study itself. Do you know offhand what the traffic level was used in the study simulation about the sort of foot passenger traffic through the security checkpoints and gates? What sort of levels is that? Clearly people will be able to go and assess the report themselves through the EUROCONTROL website, but if you've got any information to hand, that'd be really handy just to kick this question into touch.
Unfortunately, I would not like to guess on that one. So I recommend reading the study, and I know all the details are in the study.
Okay, that's a very fair response. Thank you for that. If I may now turn to Gillian, again from the APOC here at Brussels Airport, from your perspective. So you've had the simulations done to 70, the consultants provided them to Brussels Airport. You covered in the penultimate slide, or the last slide with information on it, some of the actions that you undertook last year. But what next? What about into 2021 summer period, looking at the potential level for increasing traffic of maybe 60–70% of what we saw in 2019? How is the study from 270 going to help you with that potential forecast?
Well, the study done by 270 obviously will not have any benefit for the summer, because it was an outlook for the first couple of weeks of 2021. But in general, the simulation can do the same for summer prediction. It's a way of benchmarking. First of all, I want to emphasize that it's a way of benchmarking your internal analysis with a simulation which has a higher level of granularity, and which allows you to test a multitude of scenarios as well, and which allows you also to modify operational layout and amount of manpower based on the observations that you see in the field within our operations team. So it can indeed prepare for a summer period in various scenarios on an airport-wide scale, and I think that's the benefit, that you can really go end to end from the airspace. From the airspace at EUROCONTROL and skies, all the way up to the car park and even the passenger's home, with these kinds of simulations, which strengthen our internal work done by the operations team.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. If I may now, I'd like to turn to a colleague here at Eurocontrol, Bruno Desar, the senior airport expert here at Eurocontrol. Bruno, you've got some slides to share, so I'll just do a quick introduction while you upload your slides. But looking at the surveys that we've had presented here by our colleague panelists, what has changed since last summer from your perspective and the response from your side, Bruno?
Thank you, Stephen, for the question. In order to reply to this question, actually, I will go through a survey which has been performed by Eurocontrol through the airport corner, actually, that most of airports know. This survey was undertaken in December, January, and several questions were raised to airports in order to confirm the modeling studies performed and presented by Daniel on one side and Gillian on the other side. What came out from this survey is that several things changed, obviously. The current situation is now that turnaround increase on airside, but nevertheless, this is not the major bottleneck. We realized that as airports reported that the airside capacity is not so much an issue, and there is a shift which is observed of capacity shortfall between airside and landside. And on landside, this is especially security control and immigration, which are critical. The key constraining factors for airports, as reported in the survey, are social distancing, obviously, and health measures. And nowadays, we realize that the focus is more on health passport. According to the survey, actually 77% of airports now cover the risk of pandemic in their contingency plans. Most of those airports are carrying out different measures to optimize cost effectiveness while waiting for the demand. And since last summer, the survey shows that 35% of the airport took cost-effective measures, 20% reduced their activities, 16% put underutilized infrastructure on hold, and 10% adopted new operational procedures, both should it be on the airside or landside. Some airports declared that they already reached saturation in terminals during peaks. If I refer to your forecast that you presented in the introduction, we expect in the best case scenario that 73% of traffic might be achieved this year. And some airports already declared that they are saturated. 38% of airports still foresee challenges preventing them from handling 2021 traffic level based on the traffic forecast. The key issues actually remains governmental measures like travel restriction and health passport, and there are some local constraints which are linked not only, as I mentioned, to immigration and security control, but due to the new procedures that need to be put in place in order to implement the COVID measures. More than ever, I would say that uncertainty remains the greatest enemy of predictability and a break to airport planning. And despite the traffic forecast maintained by Eurocontrol, harmonization at the European level needs to be ensured in order to minimize uncertainty and volatility in the crisis. In practice, the uncertainty on testing facilities at airports, for instance, is an issue, and especially for arrivals in particular, because this could lead to additional delay at passport control and increase a missed connection. So what's the outlook for recovery? As you mentioned, Stephen, in your introduction, Eurocontrol is continuously updating the traffic forecast based on the latest development in terms of regulation by states. The optimistic scenario now shows that 73% of traffic might be recovered in 2021. And on the other side, as presented by Daniel, the simulation performed by Eurocontrol with Airport Research Center and in cooperation with the airports showed that saturation might be achieved between 60 and 75% of their PAX volume, their passenger volume in 2019, whilst implementing the social distancing and the health measures. Some airports reported that their maximum terminal capacity was already achieved whilst implementing social distancing, providing that they are informed early enough to get prepared. 32% of the airports which replied to the airport corner survey mentioned that they could recover within 1 week or less. Nevertheless, 21% replied that they need more than 4 weeks to recover, which means that we need to predict as much as we can. Secondly, concerning the outlook for recovery, the health measures imposed by the state authorities and the social distancing remain the major constraining factors, as I mentioned, and as it is confirmed by the 2 studies that were just presented now. According to the airport corner survey, 92% of the airports still believe that social distancing will remain mandatory. And 92% of the airports still believe that face masks will remain mandatory. 35% believe that temperature checks will become mandatory, which requires additional processing in terminals for departure passengers. And 53% believe it will be mandatory for arrivals. So all those additional measures obviously increase the workload in terminals. All the challenges that were mentioned in the survey are the additional staff which are required in order to cover the workload of those COVID measures. The instability caused by the possibility of additional changes in COVID-19 rules is also an issue. And as I mentioned, uncertainty on testing facilities. How can we help airports as far as Eurocontrol is mentioned? We will go on providing traffic outlook to better plan and to provide airports the ability to get better prepared. Eurocontrol will go on monitoring closely on route delay and take actions in order to reduce the delay propagation to ground operations. Eurocontrol will also go on coordinating with airline operators to maximize predictability and minimize the airport slot adjustment as far as we can. And they will go on disseminating best practice. Actually, this webinar is all about those best practices in order to deal with COVID-19 situation as efficiently as we can, if I could say. In particular, the network manager could support airports with the rolling seasonal NOP, including the 6 weeks forecast, also with the weekly NOP recovery cell and with the airport corner that is complemented by the airport function and the information available over there and in the NMOC, and also by the airport corner. And you talked about the passengers prediction tool, which also comes in support to this. I hope this replies your question, Stephen. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruno. Yes, very comprehensive. If I can, I'd like to turn to our last panelist speaker today, Eugene Lehman, the liaison officer to Eurocontrol here from ACI Europe. Eugene, you've got some slides to share as well. So whilst they get loaded up, I'd just like to turn to the question from your perspective. So having looking at these services, these surveys, what challenges do you foresee in operations? What's temporary, what will stay, for example? Eugene, good afternoon, and over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'd like to answer with showing a few slides coming out of the survey that we held. To note that the survey from the airport corner was held somewhere in December, and from ACI was about 2 months later, so there might be difference in timing. Next slide, please. So were related to preparation of the summer 2021, the challenges, testing practices, lessons learned, outlook, and way forward. So we received some 81 responses. The majority were airport operators, some ANSP, and some others. Next slide, please. So one of the questions was, did you feel well prepared for the anticipated summer 2021? 90% said yes, and 10% indicated no. Next slide, please. What were the major bottlenecks that what we asked for the preparation summer 2020? In the graphs, you can see the process from check-in until transfer and turnaround, but the focus on the major bottlenecks was on departure and also some on arrival, and not so much on turnaround. Next slide, please. What health measure was the most challenging to implement? Most answers were given on physical distancing and health checks, of course, which is still the case today. And most airports thought that the physical distancing was the most challenging to implement, some 60%. And health checks were considered less challenging to implement. But you also have to look at the next sheet. Next sheet, please. So what measure posed more of an operational challenge once implemented? And here you can see a difference that the health checks were apparently more of an operational challenge. So you might conclude that apparently the health checks posed more operational challenges than initially foreseen. Next slide, please. Last summer, what were health measures had the largest effect on your operation? And that was like Daniel said, and also Bruno indicated, that was the physical distancing had the largest effect. Next slide, please. We also asked, okay, in preparation of the recovery process, how did you prepare yourself? What planning tools did you use, and what were most useful? We did not get a clear answer. So most airports indicated they used guidance material, checklist, simulation tool, and also some tips and lessons learned. And to note that lessons learned you can do only after evaluating after some time. So that could only be, the first conclusion could be drawn after the first summer period. Next slide, please. So we also asked questions that related to today. If there were negative COVID-19 tests were mandated. So the majority said yes, and also if there is a facility at the airport for testing facilities. And also the majority also indicated positive, or yes, I should say. Next slide, please. We also asked if there would be a testing strategy in place to increase passenger confidence to regain travel. 70% said yes, and 30% said no. And we are just wondering why this percentage was so high. Was there no reason for airports to have a strategy to regain confidence, or do they still need extra support? and we'd like to hear from you if you need extra support on this, either EUROCONTROL or ACI or IATA. We would be happy to help and to better understand where these 30% come from. Next slide, please. We asked a question about contactless technology in place. Do you have it, yes or no? Was good to know that 70% said yes, and the focus was on departure. And as Daniel indicated, that these and also Sergio, that the contactless technologies will play a very important role in future. Next slide, please. So looking to the future, we asked our airports, when do you expect to see passenger levels exceed 50%? Interesting answer. Most airports think it will be either third quarter of this year or maybe next year or next years. Most airports think that the recovery will go only starting, say, during summertime or later. Next slide, please. Would your airport be able to cope with significant increase in traffic demand this summer? The majority said yes, 85%, and 50% said no. That's why we put a circle around it, because we are a little bit worried about those 15%. What are the reasons? Are these lack of resources or maybe financial issues? We'd like to better understand why the airports responded, the 15% responded no, and if those airports would have the need for extra support. So we would like to hear from especially those airports. Next slide, please. How much lead time would you need to scale up to 50% of passengers compared to summer 2019? No clear answer. Ballpark figure somewhere 2-3 weeks. But if you compare this answer with the survey from the airport corner, you will see quite some differences, because there a lot of airports said the lead time was only 1 week. So we are just wondering why these differences come from. Next slide, please. Major bottlenecks, well, basically the same as last year. It's the focus is on from check-in to boarding, but also the arrival process, and not so much on transfer yet. Next slide, please. So here's a summary. I don't go through it all because we are running a little bit behind schedule, but we'll share the presentation if you like, and most of the elements I mentioned in the previous slides. To conclude, the last question from Stephen was, okay, what is temporary and what will stay? So we think that the level of uncertainty is temporary, as are the level of restrictions, but what will stay are the health checks, health passports, contactless technologies, and also the need to adapt to shifting traffic and passenger demand. And here I would like to conclude my answer to you, Steve.
Thank you, Eugene, again for a comprehensive response. Just before we turn to the second panel discussion, and I am mindful of the time, and I want to look towards the summer 2021, of course. But there's a question on the chat for Sergio, which I'll come to after the previous question, just to wrap up the sort of commentary we've had so far. Sergio, looking at those two surveys that have been described, what are the sort of, in a couple of sentences, what were the greatest challenges for the airlines at airports last year from the perspective of IATA? What did you see? What were the big issues there that we can then start forming into our panel 2 discussion? Sergio.
Well, I think that on the survey, it's great to see that airports are saying that they can react quickly, and the vast majority need less than 2 weeks to respond to the uptick in demand. This is very welcome, because airlines and airports need to react quickly as soon as we are able to remove restrictions. I think that's something that maybe I'm missing in the surveys, that from our point of view, the biggest challenge again was to adapt to these last minute policy changes, and just having a specific destination on green corridors, and then suddenly on the following day on red corridors. So in that sense, it was almost impossible to predict, neither for airlines nor for airports, and that's why we all struggle in specific peak moments with traffic. So I think that unless we are able to come to a better planning from the government point of view as well this summer, we could face the same situation in specific airports in specific moments as soon as they are just removing restrictions. So far, again, the European Commission is still recommending not to travel, not to do anything that is not essential traveling. So any kind of decision from any government will just make a peak on demand, or will just make the demand just to drop to the floor. So I think that is going to be a challenge that both, well, not both, airports, airlines, and also EUROCONTROL and the NSPs are going to face during this summer, hopefully.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to the second panel of discussion, if we may. We've got some questions that are coming in. Please, just as a reminder, if you need to utilise the Q&A, we've got some that are coming in, so we'll try and pick those up. Sergio, I'm going to stay with you, actually, because the second panel of discussion, as you can see there, is, okay, so we've heard all that. What are the challenges now, and what's the way ahead? What's the way forward? And one of the questions that's come in, and I think this is clearly synchronized with, one of the four key things that have come out of our presentations this afternoon. We need predictability, or there's a lack of predictability. We need some harmonization of restrictions. We need to be able to share data, whether that be through a vaccine passport, or whether that be through passenger demand, or whether that just be through the increasing volume of the network. We also, of course, have to cope with these health checks and social distancing and other medical, if you like, requirements. The question that's come in, and it really wraps this all up beautifully, is all these different measures that are here across Europe from the different states, different parts of states. When, from an IATA perspective, do you expect these different measures to be harmonized across Europe?
I hope that the answer will be yes. Unfortunately, the European Commission has not the power to impose this harmonization on the states. Health responsibilities under the states. And now we are begging the European Commission and all the states to work in an harmonized way. But as I have presented before, the states are working in isolation. The type of measure, the type of test, the type of restrictions, the criteria to use on kids, on infection rates are completely different. And that is what is, from our point of view, damaging so much the internal European market. So we hope that the European Commission is able just to move forward. And yesterday we were discussing with some colleagues in EASA and Aidan from ACI was as well, that Europe need to do more Europe in order to have a better future in aviation, tourism, and transport.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So that's sort of a response that would enable IATA perhaps to lobby to get more support, to get the harmonisation of measures. From a practical perspective, the airlines, what can they be doing to help travellers find the right information for a trip? What forms that need filling out? What passports do I need? What health passports? I mean, of course, what do I need in terms of locator forms and so on and so forth? What's the airline view on that for this summer? How can you best support that?
Well, initially we are doing a couple of things already. One of them is that we are collecting all type of restrictions that are taking place in all different countries. This is public and for free to the passengers. So if you are going to Germany, you go to the travel webpage from IATA, and you will be able to see the requirements in terms of testing, time frames, if you are able to go there or not go there, and what are the requirements. So we are providing this to the passenger. As well, this is not enough, and we have seen that we need to communicate much better and communicate the requirement to the passenger much better, and also airlines are doing a hell of a job trying to communicate to the passenger as well. And regarding the communication of the information about the health credential test, what we have launched is an initiative in order to try to facilitate the sharing of information between the passengers and governments regarding those health credentials, in order to enable for the passenger to have the okay to travel or the green light to travel before even being in the airport. So that's why the passengers will feel more confident to go to this trip, because they will have the green light from the destination that they have fulfilled all the requirements from testing, documentation, PLF, or whatever requirements is there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. I'll come to the ACI view on that particular question in a second, Eugene. But before I do, perhaps to Daniel and then Gillian, the same question. So I'm a traveller. I'm going to rock up at Alanda or at Zaventem down the road here. How can you help me as a passenger get that confidence that Sergio refers to with regard to navigating, if you like, the correct way of dealing with the pro forma that's required now? What are you doing from your perspective, Daniel?
Maybe an easy answer, but communication and predictability for our customers. I think it's really important to build trust with the customers, so they know if they come to Arlanda or Madrid or Rome airport, they could expect the same kind of procedures. And that's the harmonization part. I think is really important to build trust. I also think it's important for the airlines and all travel partners in the whole ATM network to show how good we are, because we, as the same we do with safety in terms of security, for security control, but in terms also through airline safety, it's all we have. It's everything we have is to show that you can rely on us. We're doing everything we can and a little bit more to make you have a safe travel.
Thank you. Gillian, same question. What can you do to help the passengers?
Well, as said by Daniel, I think travel in its nature is not bound to boundaries and countries themselves. So I think airports should cooperate in what could be, for example, task forces, and we could learn from each other best practices on how we can improve the passenger experience with the limitations that there are. Brussels Airport itself, we provide a lot of information on the travel itself. So we inform the passenger about the restrictions, about the document checks, about the bottlenecks that they might occur in the travel. So communication indeed is key, and letting the passenger know what they're up to will help them and will help airports as well.
Thank you. Eugene, from the ACI perspective then, looking slightly more holistically across the airports piece, where do you see the benefit that you could bring from an ACI perspective into helping here?
Yeah, to add to what Julian and Daniel said, is communication is key here. But I would like to add there that on local level, that the airport operators and the airlines really should team up to develop a very strong communication strategy, not only on the travel restrictions, but also to communicate very clearly what are the do's and don'ts for the passengers, how they need to prepare themselves. Also, when you want to have the passengers at your airport, not too early and not too late. And also that they shouldn't come to the airport when they are not fit for travel. So this is more, well in line with what Daniel with Julian said, but I think that's the key thing, that the airlines and the airport operators should really collaborate to make it very simple and clear to the passengers what to expect and what are the do's and the don'ts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got about 5 to 7 more minutes for questions. If anyone participating online wants to submit them in the Q&A, please do so, and we'll try and pick them up. While that's going on, I'd like to turn to, we've looked at a lot of studies and a lot of surveys in the last sort of hour almost. Do we need any more of this, or do we just now need to harmonise our approach as IATA and ACI and the airports to try and provide the most suitable platform for encouraging the return to travel? Or is there some area that we've yet unexplored, for example, in simulations? Perhaps if I could, I'll go to Daniel with that question first. From your perspective, do we need any more studies or simulations, or is it just trying to get some more predictability coming in?
Oh, I must say the Swedish answer that we need to do a bit of both, actually. I think it's important to go on because new measures will be implemented. I saw some good questions in the comment here, what we will do with when passengers are vaccinated. How will we mix them with not vaccinated passengers? I think that's really important to study. But as mentioned, we need to harmonize. We need to get our things together and make sure that we are harmonized to prepare to welcome our passengers back to the airports.
Thank you. And the same question then, Gillian, do we need anything more from your perspective? Do you intend to run simulations again?
Yeah, we absolutely do. I think this summer we're going to run a variety of additional simulations. I think we also have to include the learnings from other airports, from other continents as well. How do airports cope with the demand, and how do they plan for passenger travel in areas where they have already improved or where they're already further with the vaccination program, where you can already travel domestically, for example? How can we learn for that on a European scale? And I think airports should be helping each other. And I think that's I mean, Brussels Airport, we ourselves, we're setting up a small branch where we will support other airports in the airport operations center, in airport planning, optimization and planning as well. So I think we have to gather ourselves and look ahead for summer and further than summer, because I mean, it might be something that sticks even slightly in the future.
Thank you. We've got some questions coming in about pandemics in general. I don't mean to perhaps ignore the questions, but generally speaking, are we ready for the next pandemic? Have we learnt the lessons of the last 12 months sufficiently that should this happen again, let's look positively from 2024 onwards? Are we ready for dealing with this, or are we just going to return to how things were? Perhaps I can address that question firstly to Sergio from your perspective. Are the airlines ready? Are we able to handle this again? Are we able to scale ourselves up and down in an appropriate manner?
Yeah, I think that we have demonstrated during 2020 that we are able to adapt, and that we have been ahead of the curve regarding guidance, regarding the measures, regarding how to react to the specific situations. What I'm not so confident is that the European member states are ready to handle, another pandemic that is different. And I think that from the industry point of view, I'm sure that we are able to cope with that. But we need to push further this harmonization at the European level.
Thank you. Can I address the same question then to Aidan, perhaps from the ACI perspective? Do we need, from a vaccination perspective, is there a benefit in the vaccination passports that people are proposing, or is it going to cause us some issues with regard to, do we need people vaccinated? Do we need people to have COVID tests? Do we need people to have evidence of previous infection? What's the perspective going forwards for the summer this year from the ACI view there, Aidan?
Yeah, exactly. I think that would be extremely helpful to have this. I think we need to be wary of having concrete requirements in black and white, which could end up being dissuading people from traveling because the barriers may be too high or too cumbersome. But anything which can grease the wheels, I think, is extremely valuable. And if you can make progress on that front, it can be a great help.
So some flexibility, some coordination, some harmonization amongst airports and, of course, amongst airlines to try and lobby to get that sort of flexibility back into it. Again, I'm mindful of the time, so perhaps I'd like to address a question to each of the panelists, if I may. And Aidan, I'll come to you first. What would be the sort of most helpful hint or tip that you might like to give to the participants who have connected in today, this afternoon, with regard to the coming summer season? If you could just pick one thing, what would it be that you would request people to consider most fully as they prepare for the coming recovery, such as it will be?
I'd say take a very good audit of your airport operation, where the pinch points would be, and do a sort of assessment of your own of where the impact of distancing, etc., could cause problems and how to overcome that.
Thank you. I'd address the same question, if I may, to Daniel from the Orlando perspective. If you had one thing that you'd like participants to take away for the coming season, what would it be?
Joint situational awareness with all actors, picking up on what Aidan mentioned here, that go through the bottlenecks at the airport, but do it together with all the actors at the airport and understanding their problem. Are the ground handlers ready? Are ATC ready? Are the cleaners ready? Are everyone ready, basically? Because we need to help each other managing this summer. So collaboration and a joint situational awareness.
Thank you. I'll take the same question, if I may, to Gillian. From your perspective, sir, what would be your one tip or one thing that you would ask people to remember?
Well, I wrote down the ecosystem as a whole as well. That's the problem of having two great people answering always before me. But I'll add something else. Being, for example, investing in technology and process optimization, opposed to, for example, infrastructure development. So let's invest in technology, touchless technology, slot-based travel more and more to make it even more efficient for passengers and airport operators and the ecosystem using it.
Thank you. The same question, if I may, Eugene, from the ACI perspective. I know Aidan's already given his view, but for your view, what would be your, please participants, bear this in mind for the season ahead?
My comment would be for airport operators, know your lead time before you can scale up or scale down. Because from the surveys, we got a wide variety on answers, and I think it makes sense for airports to investigate, to know exactly how much time you need to get all the resources together. So that is my feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. All good points so far. Sergio, from the airline perspective, what would you like to say to the participants, especially perhaps the airport participants from the IATA perspective, the one thing that you'd like them to really consider and take home with them this afternoon from this webinar for the season ahead?
I think that two parts, from the hard point of view, and it was mentioned before, the automation and the investing in technology and digitalization, this is key. And from the soft point of view, and it was also mentioned, this collaboration and just strengthening the communication with the airlines, the ground handlers, and all the stakeholders to ensure that we all act and plan as one unit, and we are able just to have a common goal. We have seen in 2020 that when teams are coordinated, we are able to achieve better results.
Thank you. And finally, Bruno, from the Eurocontrol and the Eurocontrol Airports unit perspective, what would be your one request for people to take away?
Well, actually, I think, and this comes back to the points mentioned earlier a little bit, but we need to disseminate as much as possible best practices. And for this, we need harmonization and we need collaboration with all the actors involved.
Okay, thank you. So some really consistent messages there. And I hope that the webinar has given you an overview of what's been going on previously, but also, of course, what's to come. I'd like now, if I may, to hand back to Aidan to wrap up the webinar and to close us out. Aidan, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Hang on, I'm just bringing up some closing slides, which I was just clicking through them very briefly, and glad to see that much of them are probably redundant now because everyone has already given their key takeaway and are in lines with what we noted down. So that's good to see. But yeah, just thought we'd finish by summing up the key takeaways for everybody, which have been neatly covered by everybody. What airports need to be looking at, as we said, what are the effects of distancing and other checks, etc., on your capacity, on your procedures, and what should you be planning for? So what we see here is, of course, the outcomes of the ARC study in particular, which will now be not much surprise to anybody, but should be looked at very closely, as we recommended by all airports, and how this would translate into the operation at your airport. So one piece of advice, go away and take a good look at this and assess the consequences at your airport. As our co-panelists have mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, please be aware, of course, physical distancing, the largest effect on your operation, but bear in mind also that health checks are more challenging to implement where required. Airports, of course, need to determine the amount of flexibility required to cope with unforeseen circumstances. Will flights be operating? How many passengers will be boarding that aircraft? How much lead time do you need to scale up, and by how much? Likewise for scaling down, so you can optimize the use of your limited resources, reduce costs, and ultimately rebuild confidence in air travel, so passengers are not put off by endless queues, which they may perceive as a potential health hazard, and missed flights, etc., etc. What else do airports need to think about? Making contactless technologies a priority, which we're glad to see from our survey, some 70% of airports are already working on. This is something which is clearly going to be one of the main holdovers from the current crisis into our general life in future, just like teleworking, just like video conferences such as this. Again, this contributes to optimizing use of limited resources, facilitating a smooth passenger journey, and rebuilding confidence in travel. What else do we need to do? Team up with their airlines, as we just said, look across the whole ecosystem of the airport, informing passengers on do's and don'ts, keeping them informed, making sure that they're clear on when they should be at the airport, what they should do if they do not meet travel requirements. Stay home, do not travel. Same effect as before, as well as ensuring we all stay as safe as possible. So I think we're all quite clear on the main takeaways from this webinar today. It's been extremely useful, and glad to see so many participants. Please do keep us informed of your additional suggestions and comments. This is an ongoing process, which, as we just said, Daniel in particular said we need to be working on all together. So the more we exchange, the more we ask questions of each other, the better we'll have a recovery which works for all our industry and ultimately for passengers. So from our side, from ACI Europe, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Eurocontrol for hosting both technically and physically in the presence of Stephen as a moderator. And yeah, wishing everybody a very good rest of the day, and a lot of success as the restart comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Aidan. I would like to echo your thanks to all of our panelists and the participants. Just a quick note, the webinar recordings will be available on the Eurocontrol website so that people can share with their colleagues or other interested people. If you've got any questions, do send them in. Please take care, keep safe, look after yourselves. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to make contact again very shortly. Thank you to everyone. Keep safe.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.